Sometimes games have all the hype in the world, but they just never quite live up to the expectation. Hype can be a double-edged sword. It can build up money. It can build up a fan base before a game's even released, but sometimes it can make expectations way beyond the capabilities of the development. Now, that shouldn't have been an issue with Obsidion, because Obsidion Entertainment had made its name crafting beloved RPGs like Fallout New Vegas and Pillars of Eternity, games known for rich storytelling and player choice. So in 2018, Microsoft acquired the company, giving the studio resources to pursue a bigger project. So not long after, Obsidion revealed Avowed at the Xbox Games Showcase. A brief teaser trailer depicted the first-person fantasy RPG set in Aura, the world of Pillars of Eternity. Complete with the spellcasting and sword-wielding protagonist, fans immediately buzzed with excitement. This looks like Obsidian's answer to Bethesda's Elder Scrolls, but their own standalone version, as one commentator put it. So, this is the Elder Scrolls competitor we've all heard about. They have some big shoes to fill. The teaser's tone was dark and epic, showing runic magic and skeletal foes, which led many to expect a serious Skyrim-like adventure in Obsidian's style. Behind the scenes, Avowed had been actually pitched, though, as something even more ambitious. In 2018, Obsidian courted Microsoft's investment. They envisioned Avowed as the magnum opus, a cross between Destiny and Skyrim that allowed players to adventure together in massive worlds. In other words, early on, Avowed was conceived as multiplayer or a live service game, perhaps an open world co-op RPG, and thus Microsoft greenlit the project. After the acquisition, the game had entered full development, but as the flashy 2020 announcement rolled out into the public, internally, Avowed was struggling. Development how? The development timeline of Avowed turned into a saga of its own. By late 2020, the team had attempted 2 different vertical slice builds, essentially prototypes demonstrating core gameplay, and even cut the planned multiplayer component. Yet the game was still failing to coalesce into a fun, workable state. Morale was getting pretty shaky. In early January of 2021, Obsidian leadership made the drastic call to just reboot the project with new directors and vision. Rumors started to come out about behind-the-scenes turmoil. Jason Schrader would later report Avowed went through multiple reboots and direct changes in this period. With a twist of timing, the all-hands meeting was announced to reboot the game, and that was scheduled for January the 6th of 2021. So, Kari Patel was appointed as the new game director in 2021, tasked with righting this ship. Patel and a reorganized leadership team built the tracks whilst the train was already moving, keeping dozens of developers busy on a project that was essentially starting over. They had about 80 people expecting to move into full production and had now had to pivot the design radically. During this reboot, the team doubled down on Pillars of Eternity, lore, and story, emphasizing connections to the franchise's rich narrative universe. At the same time, they scaled back on the game's world design, and the original grand vision of a seamless Skyrim-like open world was deemed unfeasible, given technical and timeline constraints. Instead, Avowed shifted to open zone structure, akin to Obsidian's 2019 hit The Outer Worlds, focusing on a smaller but denser regions rather than one sprawling map. As Patel explained, they knew from The Outer Worlds that they could craft excellent contained areas, and trying to climb every mountain for massive open world was impossible under the circumstances. Some at the studio surely felt the sting of sacrificing the go-anywhere scale of Skyrim, but it was a necessary compromise to make this game actually achievable. This period also saw a tonal shift of the game. The 2020's teaser art direction was moody and dark, implying a gritty atmosphere. But under the new direction, Avowed took a more vibrant, adventurous tone, more Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire than Skyrim. Patel later said the goal was to balance of a grounded political intrigue, otherworldly mysteries, and moments of levity, aligning Avowed's feeling close to Deadfire's mix of tones. This would become a point of contention, though, when some fans, when the gameplay was finally shown, found the art style almost too cartoonish compared to the teaser, almost shouting false advertising. But internally, the team pressed on. This new vision throughout 2021 and 2022 was essentially rebuilding the game, and that was always their plan. And things started to quieten down, at least in the public. No new trailers, no major info, and these drastic changes were happening all but behind closed doors. By mid-2023, the project had found its footing once again. Avowed was re-revealed at Xbox Games Showcase in June of that year, this time with an actual gameplay trailer. The new trailer confirmed the game's setting, living lands in a region of Era. It showed first-person combat and exploration, but fans immediately noticed differences, at least from what was displayed first. The visuals, as mentioned, were more colourful and fantastical, the tone more swashbuckling than ominous. We saw the player characters casting spells and wielding swords, companionships with quirky Amura character named Kai, who was the person that narrated the trailer, various creatures, and these are all parts of the game that people weren't quite expecting to be there. Obsidian CEO Fergus Uhart accompanied the trailer with a blog post describing some of the features and media interviews with Kari Patel providing details. I mean, it was now being built on Unreal Engine 5, having been started on the previous version of that epic engine, and it was aiming to be focused on narrative-rich experience rather than the endless sandbox, which I think was a bit of a change for many people. Internally, the team was, well, calming down a bit. At this point, Avowed was targeting a late 2024 launch. In fact, marketing materials initially pegged it for fall of 2024, but the date drew nearer, and it became clear that more polish was needed. But after nearly 6 years of development and a couple of reboots, Avowed was finally set to release, marketing the hype. Leading up to launch, Microsoft and Obsidian had tried to stoke hype for Avowed, though some fans sent a more muted excitement compared to early expectations. The marketing strategy included big trailers at the showcases for Xbox, a slot at Xbox Developers Direct in 2024. There was also a gameplay deep dive that was being shown. A pre-order campaign where, we saw the game was a hefty budget. $70 for the standard edition, $90 for the digital premium, which granted up to 5 days of early access. That would later come and bite them in the ass. The premium edition also had exclusive cosmetic skins for companions, digital art books and soundtracks, and even a physical steelbox edition. This was a huge budget. This approach of selling early access at such a price set expectations so high. It became a AAA release, even though that may not have been what the initial intentions were. On paper, though, the stage was set for Avowed to be one of the biggest releases of 2025. It even featured in the Game's Past titles sizzle reel. There were some warning signs that I think many people missed. An early preview build distributed to selected press and content creators had mixed reactions. Whilst the game's art direction and punchy combat earned some praise, various previews noted Avowed felt more limited in scope than anticipated. Obsidian developers emphasized Avowed was not trying to be a limitless open world, but more of a focused experience, a message they kept having to repeat and feeling like people weren't getting it. Of course, people thought that Avowed would be Obsidian's personal take on Skyrim, but the studio were trying to quell those rumors. For some fans, that was fine. The Outer Worlds had proven a smaller-scale RPG could be satisfying. However, many remained skeptical, worried that this might end up feeling way too constrained for the type of genre that they're trying to get into. Launch day. Avowed finally launched on February 18th, 2025. First, things looked fine. The review embargo lifted just before launch. The critical reviews were mildly positive, nothing incredible, but nothing horrific. If we aggregate a lot of the reviews, it scored around 80 out of 100. For example, Metacritic showed that Xbox and PC versions launched at the low 80s, and OpenCritic similarly had it around an 80 average. I mean, it wasn't the blockbuster game of the year that some hoped, especially the studio, but it was seen as a decent game. Yet, reading between the lines, even the positive reviews carried somewhat of a tone of disappointment. One reviewer quipped that Avowed, at its best, is aggressively average, and at its worst, shockingly shallow, with very little to offer players. They advise most people wait for a deep sale before buying. This is always a killer for games, especially games that have hype built up over years and multiple development cycles, because they couldn't afford an average game. The money that had been put into it, this had to be a hit. Another review from Den of Geek pointing out that reviews will certainly disappoint those who expect it to be a Skyrim-like adventure, because judged as an epic fantasy RPG, it falls short in most of what people want in narrative and depth. Then, of course, it gets pretty intense. If critics were mixed, players' reactions were far more negative. Upon release, Avowed suffered the fate of many high-profile titles these days, scores in the red for most of its users. Within days, the user rating averaged around 4.5 out of 10. Unhappy customers. I mean, Steam's initial user reviews skewed mixed. There was plenty of discussion. The divide between journalists and users was bigger than ever. This is something that we see time and time again, but it didn't seem like it was going away, especially in Avowed's case. Even in the Steam discussions for Avowed, some players coined Enemy of the People awards for some of these outlets that scored it way too high in their opinion, sort of hyperbolic, but it illustrates the feeling of betrayal among a lot of hardcore fans. They felt Avowed got a pass from some critics despite glaring flaws, and this kind of industry circle jerk leads to bad games being let off the hook, at least many people felt. So, what are these glaring flaws? What are the horrific issues that people keep bringing up? Immediately upon playing, many found Avowed to be technically rough, content light, and design-wise a step back for Obsidion. On PC, a chorus of complaints arose about performance issues, people calling it a technical disaster in 2025 from a company that shouldn't be doing things like this. Players reported constant stuttering whenever entering new areas, lots of minor glitches and even crashes and game-breaking bugs. The game failed, others noted visual problems like flickering and artifacting. One Obsidian forum post suggested turning off certain graphic settings, trying to reduce this. I mean, not exactly the plaster on a fix for a AAA game. On Xbox Series X, the game ran a bit better, but still had frequent frame rate dips and long loading times between a lot of the open zones. It wasn't an outright catastrophe like a Cyber 2077 launch, but it was, well, not even close to perfect. Beyond the technical problems, Avowed gameplay and content proved underwhelming to a lot of people, especially those expecting Obsidian's trademark depth. One of the most highly upvoted Reddit reviews from disappointed fans summarized it pretty well. I had high expectations for this game, but the simple fact is that it's extremely underwhelming. Barely existent story, bad loot and gear system, barren large towns, and a lack of immersion. Dialogue is awful and just rambles on and on with the most forgettable side characters. I loved Outer World and almost everything else from Obsidian, but this game can't even hold a candle to any of them. It lacks soul, and it just feels like a time sink for Game Pass subscribers to latch onto. This quote encapsulates the major complaints: bare bones story with none of the memorable characters or choices one would expect, bland, buggy RPG systems, surprisingly empty or lifeless locations, and a general sense that it lacked the soul of past Obsidian efforts. A dig about the time sink for Game Pass subscribers was definitely a poignant one. I mean, Game Pass is an interesting one. We'll discuss that angle shortly, but many players cynically felt like Avowed existed just to pad Game Pass's lineup, not actually to push the RPG genre forward, and I think in some ways there is a lot of truth in that. Indeed, specific design criticisms were repeated often in community discussions. Role-playing elements were shallow. You create a character, pick a background, but players found these choices have minimal impact on gameplay and story. One said, don't stress too much about picking your background. It mostly results in a few different lines of dialogue and often brings you back to the same conversation. Notable decisions with substantially different outcomes are few and far between. Unlike Obsidian's past RPGs, there was no robust branching narrative or reactivity. Many choices felt cosmetic. There's also no morality or karma system. Being a jerk in dialogue has no lasting consequences beyond an NPC quip. And this is one of the biggest letdowns. I mean, someone said Obsidian saw their personality and soul within this game, and whilst that's a pretty extreme take, it shows how betrayed a lot of long-term fans felt about this. And the story and writing didn't escape criticism either. The main plot of Avowed: you're a god-touched envoy investigating magical blight in the living lands, and it was generally, well, as you'd expect, generic and forgettable. The game lacked the sharp wit or memorable characters of a title like Outer World. Even your companions in Avowed, a diverse bunch ranging from coastal Amur warriors to an undead character that were seen as underdeveloped. Unlike companions in, let's say, Mass Effect or Obsidian's own Pillars games, these allies didn't leave a strong impression. Their personal quests and dialogues were few, and many players reported not even feeling much of a bond with them whatsoever. Now, one area that Obsidian clearly put some combat into was the combat. They emphasized it in marketing as visceral action with spells, swords, and guns, and indeed some players enjoyed the moment-to-moment fighting and experimentation with builds. The game lets you dual-wield magic and melee, swap between two loadouts, and use various elemental spells. Early impressions from critics said the combat was punchy and fun. However, as players sank more hours in, cracks started to show here too. The combat encounters grew repetitive, basic hack and slash tactics working in most situations. Enemies were often damage sponges and not very tactical, leading to spamming high damage attacks. As one reviewer observed, regardless of your character build, most fights boiled down to a similar formula. Use a couple of powerful skills, dodge or kite an enemy, and repeat. Only the hardest difficulty did combat require more strategy, and even then it could be cheesed by exploiting AI quirks like, I don't know, luring a foe behind an obstacle. Furthermore, whilst the game features multiple skill trees, wizards, rangers, fighters, etc., many of the upgrades were just percentage buffs, like +5 damage, not new gameplay altering abilities. The notable exception was the magical system though. Wizard abilities were more exciting and flashy, whereas melee and range builds felt more static. In essence, Avowed's combat was serviceable but lacked the depth or evolution seen in top tier action RPGs. It wasn't the revolution in first person combat that one might have hoped, especially when when games like Elden Ring had set a high bar for challenging and varied combat in RPGs. Lastly, Avowed made design choices that limited immersion. Players noticed things like NPCs lacking daily routines or much interactivity. Towns felt like static backdrops with quest givers standing in place, a far cry from the living worlds of Skyrim where NPCs had their own schedules. And I think this looked even worse because of when it came out. Avowed came out just after Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. This was a game that prowessed itself on incredible immersion and the living lives of historically accurate NPCs. They would all do their daily schedule, go to sleep in the same place, do the same thing, even take their clothes off before they go into bed. It was so incredible and immersive that putting it side by side with, well, a cartoon like Avowed made the latter look even worse. You also couldn't do chaotic things, like you couldn't even attack friendly NPCs or drastically affect settlements. I mean, there were so many clips of people going around just hitting NPCs and no one reacting in any way, shape or form. For an RPG in 2025, what's going on there? Avowed funneled players into a fixed narrative path, and this was by design. Obsidian did want a curated story-focused game, but I think to most people, this just made the world feel artificial and constrained. One disappointed fan on Reddit summed it up by saying the game's world felt barren and lacking immersion, with big towns that nonetheless felt empty. The exploration element was there, but it wasn't the kind of sandbox where you could ignore the story and just live in the world. For some players, that was fine, but others expected more freedom in a first-person RPG. All these factors coalesced such that within a week, Avowed had a reputation as a flop. It may not have been a flop in the extreme technical sense, but in the terms of reception and impact, it's seriously underdelivered, quickly becoming one of the biggest hot topics within the fanbase. Let's have a look at the whole picture. Several key reasons emerge for why Avowed is widely considered a failure or disappointment. It's clear that Avowed's tumultuous development, multiple reboots, director changes, and the wholesale redesign of scope resulted in a compromised final product, let's say. The decision to cut multiplayer and switch from open world to segmented zones may have been necessary to finish the game, but it also meant that Avowed lost some of its wow factor, features that hype had hung onto. These never made it to release, leaving some fans feeling like the promises were unfulfilled. To Obsidian's credit, they never explicitly promised those in marketing, but the initial pitch and trailer implied a grand fantasy epic. The final game, whilst respectable, felt comparatively modest. There was also first impressions, which, as if you're not aware, do matter. Avowed's were rough. Performance problems, bugs, stability issues, particularly on PC, created an immediate perception of subpar products. Screenshots of glitches and complaints about stutter spread online very quickly. In an era where games like Elden Ring and Breath of the Wild can deliver these fast worlds with relatively few hitches, players have little patience for a game that both runs poorly and isn't offering something spectacular, and especially when it costs the same as the prior. There was also just not much of a game. The biggest factor was Avowed simply didn't excel in any particular dimension to win players over. The story was passable but forgettable. The RPG mechanics were shallow. The combat was fun but a bit repetitive. The art where a world was pretty but not breathtaking. Everything was middle of the road, and as some joked, aggressively average. For a full-price title in a competitive genre, that mediocrity isn't good enough. Moreover, coming from Obsidian, a studio revered for narrative-driven RPGs, the lack of meaningful player choice and consequences, well, seen as a betrayal of their brand. In short, Avowed didn't deliver a standout experience in narrative, systems, or technology, and it also failed to justify the hype to its stronger competitors. Let's talk a little bit about that Game Pass, though. This is a nuanced but kind of important factor. Avowed was a day one Game Pass title, meaning millions of subscribers could play it for free if they already had subscription, rather than buy it outright. This certainly boosted player numbers for people that actually tried it, and Microsoft reportedly said Avowed reached 5 million players in its first month. On the surface, that sounds like a hit, but that's just misleading. It doesn't equate to traditional sales or a satisfied player base. Many of those 5.9 million probably just booted it up, played for a few hours or even less, and dropped it. The fact that the average concurrent players on Steam dropped below 8,000 within a week of launch is a very, very low figure. Microsoft isn't concerned about raw sales numbers for a title like Avowed. What matters is that Game Pass continues to attract and retain subscribers. They likely paid Obsidian upfront for Avowed's development as part of their first-party investment, so Obsidian wasn't relying on individual sales to recoup costs. They could sell poorly and still be considered part of the Game Pass content strategy. Indeed, some argued that Microsoft's willingness to put a game on subscription without pushing for excellent results, well, means that we get lower overall quality gains. As one critic put it, the strategy can yield content that is poor, low quality, and poorly developed, made just to fill the catalog to retain subscribers. You can sort of liken it to Netflix pumping out average shows for the sake of volume. They don't care about the individual reviews as long as people are still paying that monthly subscription. In the immediate aftermath of Avowed's flop, Obsidian and Microsoft adopted a relatively low-profile stance. There was no public apology or manifesto from the developers, as we've seen of the likes of No Man's Sky, or of course CD Projekt Red famously issuing statements apologizing for Cyberpunk's 2077 state. Instead, Obsidian quietly pushed out patches, addressing technical issues and tried to improve the experience for those still playing. I mean, when we say those still playing, I really do mean the few. Currently, we have 244 people concurrently on the game, which is a far reach from the incredible AAA title that they were hoping to have. The game itself has a couple of DLCs, but they're just premium upgrades and digital art books. In terms of actual continuous development, it seems that it's so few and far between. Of course, they still push it out every now and then. It's now been verified on Steam Deck. Of course, 1.4 came out and there was a new roadmap as well, trying to detail extra stuff that was coming to the game, but it was small things: map exploration enhancement, critter loot drops, new party camp features. Nothing big and nothing really to overhaul the game that they thought they had. Overall, Avowed is a bit of a mess. I don't think it's going to get the same love as a No Man's Sky or even a Cyberpunk. I don't think it can ever come back from the depths that it was, because it's not like a game that had potential that just didn't reach it. It was a game that never really had that potential with the road the developers were searching for in the first place. If they'd gone down the huge open world RPG, maybe with the co-op elements, that could have been a possibility. But I do not think in 2025 Obsidian's vision is one that resonates with a fan base. But please let me know what you think. Leave a comment down below if you think that Avowed could make it back in time, or do we think it's over for this Obsidian disappointment?